everyone. We're going to wait another minute or two as people sign on before we start. Thank you for joining us. And just be patient for another minute or two.
Sure.
Okay, I think we are ready to start. First, welcome everyone. My name is William Edelglass, and I serve as Director of Studies here at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies in Barry, Massachusetts. And before I introduce Fran and Ruth, I just want to give some sense of how the evening will unfold. First, though, let me just say that if you would like to have closed captions and be able to read the text of what is being said in real time, you can go down to the bar across the bottom of your Zoom page and click on live transcript. And then you will get an option to show subtitle. We're going to be having a conversation tonight about the aesthetic expression of the Dharma, and we'll do that for about an hour. And then there's going to be an opportunity to pose questions for Fran and Ruth. To ask a question, feel free to write at any time in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having any technical difficulties, you can send an email to contact@buddhistinquiry.org. And thank you to my colleagues, Julia and Cassie, for making all these logistical processes work so smoothly. So I'm really honored to be introducing two figures whose work I've benefited from and who I admire so much. Fran Cho is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where she teaches and researches broadly in Buddhist studies. In addition to her many writings on Buddhism and science, if you're interested in Buddhism and science, I recommend Fran's work above perhaps anybody else's thinking about mind and matter and the brain and how we even think about Buddhism and science. But Fran is also one of the foremost scholars on the aesthetic expression of the Dharma, especially in fiction, poetry, and film, with a particular focus on East Asian Buddhism. She is the author of Embracing Illusion, Truth and Fiction in the Dream of the Nine Clouds, Religion and Science in the Mirror of Buddhism, Everything Yearned For, Man-Hae's Poems of Love and Longing. I imagine many people do not know who Man-Hae was. He was a fascinating figure, a Buddhist monk who was also very active in the anti-colonial movement in the first part of the 20th century in Japan. And he wrote the most amazing and beautiful love poems, which are available in English because of Fran's translations. And her most recent book is Seeing Like the Buddha, Enlightenment Through Film. And I personally have found Fran's writings to be inspiring, accessible, deeply insightful, and I frequently used her work in my own teaching. And I'm so grateful, Fran, that you are joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Ruth Ozeki is a novelist, a filmmaker, a Soto Zen priest affiliated with the Brooklyn Zen Center and the Everyday Zen Foundation. She's the author of My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, and A Tale for the Time Being, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize. And most recently, the Book of Form and Emptiness that was just published this fall. Ruth has also made some really interesting films that I also recommend. And I am very happy to say that Ruth spent 3 months with us during COVID at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, and is also a professor of creative writing in English at Smith. So Thank you so much, Ruth.
Well, thank you for saving my life and giving me refuge at the Barry Center. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we
It was
appreciate it.
wonderful. Yeah.
So, Fran, I'd like to begin with you. You've been working on, as a scholar, working on questions of truth and fiction and the expression of the Dharma in literary works. There's a wonderful book that you wrote in the 1990s about a 17th century Korean novel, which explores the very question we're here to talk about tonight in this historical context. And I'm wondering if you can begin by sharing a little bit about that novel and that work that you wrote and how you think about some of the history of the role of fiction in teaching the Dharma, embodying the Dharma, sharing the Dharma. Maybe we could start there.
Okay, great. Thank you for your question. So this book is about the Korean novel called The Dream of the Nine Clouds, which was written at the end of the 17th century. But rather than getting into too many details about that particular work of fiction, I think it's more interesting to emphasize the fact that it's one of many examples of the dream tale in East Asian culture, which is very much associated with the Buddhist teaching of the ephemerality and the impermanence of life. So there's a particular structure and point of the dream tale, which is within, it's a frame story. So within that story, you usually have some protagonist, a male who has great ambitions in life and suffers the usual anxieties about achieving them. And in a Confucian context society, that would entail passing imperial examinations, getting a government posting, marrying the right woman, and essentially upholding the reputation and fortunes of your clan. So many worldly responsibilities. And what happens in this frame tale, the dream tale, is the person falls asleep and in the course of the dream that he has, achieves all of the ambitions that he's harboring in his actual life. And a significant literary factor here is that the dream itself is very short, and often there's like a time marker. So when the man falls asleep, perhaps a pot of rice has been set on the stove to cook. In the course of the dream, he lives his entire life, but at the very end, he comes to a kind of sense of disillusionment. Like he doesn't feel the satisfaction that he had expected to, or perhaps, things have kind of come to a bad turn for him. And so at this point of disillusionment, he wakes up, sees that the pot of rice has just finished cooking. So there's that time marker to emphasize how short the dream was. But in the context of the dream, he's lived his whole life. And not only that, he's learned a valuable lesson of living a full life, which is the realization that life is very short. And many of the ambitions that we hold very close to us don't bring the fulfillment and satisfaction that we think they do. And the conclusion of the dream tale is that through the dream, the person learns this lesson as if he had actually lived that life, but through the mechanism essentially of art, if you will, because I think the dream is parallel, it's exchangeable with the idea of a novel or any sort of act of the imagination, which you might say isn't really real in our normal understanding of things, as life is real, but dreams are not, novels and fiction is not, or a movie is not. But the point is, its efficacy in teaching a very important, Buddhist derived lesson. And what fascinated me about the dream tale is its implicit self-referentiality. In other words, the dream tale is a story. So it's a literary work. And within that literary work, it's implicitly speaking of a literary work, which is the dream. And because the dream is so efficacious, it's so useful in teaching a religious lesson, it's implicitly pointing to the power of storytelling, that story of the dream itself, right? Of accomplishing these very important philosophical, existential, religious ends. So that's what fascinated me about the dream tale, and the way Kim Man-jung used it to reflect on his own life. But really, if you really want a great introduction to the dream tale, it's most the pinnacle of its realization, then I would have to point you to the 18th century Chinese novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, which follows essentially the same structure, but is the most, I think, realized and excellent as a work of literary art. But even most importantly, that book bears within itself a very self-conscious reflection on its own status as a book. And I've talked long enough, so I won't go into that detail, but I just want to leave it at that and say, you have this history in East Asian literature of this very Buddhist themed writing in which the book is very conscious of itself as a work of literary creation, and in that manner speaks to its own religious virtues. And that's what I find so fascinating about Ruth's own fiction, the latest one, in which books are literally a character, right, in the book. And so you have these, multiple frames of referentiality in which the power of the imagination and of literary creation is really sort of the central character.
That's fascinating. The Dream of the Red Chamber is also, you said it's a framed tale. Is the book conscious though? Is the book a character?
Yes.
Oh, fascinating.
Yes, it is. It is
fascinating.
It is, and it takes advantage of the frame tale format before you actually get into the story, which comprises the dream of the main character. You have this outer frame in which the book itself asks the reader, do you know what the origins of this book that you're holding in your hands are? Well, I will tell you. And that it gets into a fantasy tale utilizing traditional Chinese myths to tell the story of the main character sort of in the outer frame. And then to go on and talk about how the book that the reader is reading was constructed. So yes, it in the course of creating that frame tale and that literary structure, what the novel is actually saying is, I have the power through myself as a work of imagination to give you an experience that is so moving, so persuasive, so vivid, that you won't know the difference between illusion and reality, between what's real and what's not real.
So this is
when
a kind of
something that is unreal gives you such a vivid experience, then it creates this philosophical, existential, religious question about the nature of reality.
So it's like an unwilling suspension of disbelief. It's so completely convincing that there's no disbelief to be dispensed with.
Yeah, well, I think of it as a paradoxical balance between belief and disbelief. Right. And
Sure.
Isn't that what creativity, creative art, that's the experience we're invited into.
Yeah.
Especially in reading a novel, watching a film. Perhaps with I don't know, visual arts. I'm not equipped to think about that or comment on it, but I'm talking about fictional works. When you're engaged in experiencing fiction, you are in this paradoxical mindset of both knowing that it's unreal and yet experiencing it perhaps even more vividly than you might experience most of the days of your own life.
Sure.
Yeah.
I find that to be true all the time.
Right.
When I'm reading, yes.
Yeah. Or you may experience fiction and imagination as something that brings clarity and insight into your own life, which might otherwise only bring dullness or confusion.
Right. Or boredom or
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So
I mean, that's why we read and that's why we write. Thank goodness, right? Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. And so what I think all of my work on Buddhism and literature in the East Asian context is focused on is this long history of this cultural awareness of this quality of the fictive imagination, and using that to self-consciously reflect on essentially very Buddhist principles and ideas, that otherwise is more abstract, dependent arising, emptiness, and so forth.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Fran. That was really helpful. And thinking of self-referentiality and a book that can speak. I wonder if it'd be helpful to have an example of that, maybe from Ruth, from your work, if you want to share some of your most recent book to give us an example of what that might look like.
Sure. I just want to bookmark one thing that I would love to come back to, Fran, and that is I'd love to come back and speak to this idea of voice, and in particular, the Western convention of the omniscient narrator. And that's just, I'm making a note because I don't want to forget that, because it's, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, so my new book is, it's called The Book of Form and Emptiness. And it's about a boy who, when he's 12 years old, loses his father in a really stupid and tragic accident. Benny is quite traumatized by this death, and in the aftermath, he starts to hear voices. The first voice he hears is the voice of his father calling his name, and then later that his father's voice sort of drops away, but he starts to hear other voices, which belong to the things, the objects in his house, just kind of random things, his sneaker, a Christmas ornament, a piece of wilted lettuce in the refrigerator. And the voices of these things, they seem to be speaking to him. He doesn't quite understand exactly what the things are saying, but he understands their feeling tone, okay? And so this is very disturbing to him. What makes it worse is that his mother, Annabelle, who has lost her husband, who is the love of her life. She's started working from home, and she's become a bit of a hoarder, as maybe we all have during the pandemic when we've been forced to move home, move our offices into our bedrooms. So their house is quite chaotic, and it's filled with things, with objects that won't shut up. Eventually, the voices start to follow Benny to school, and he starts acting out. He gets in trouble, and is sent to a psychiatrist, who, when she finds out about the voices, sends him for observation on a pediatric psych ward. Eventually, he leaves this, and the voices are still there. They're still troubling to him. And after he's discharged, he starts hanging out at a large public library, which of course is a location filled with speaking things, right? I mean, books speak to us, right? But the library, at the library, of course, all of the things are orderly, right? They speak in their quiet library voices. And so Benny finds it to be a real, a refuge. And he meets all sorts of people there. He meets the kind of denizens of the library. He meets a young, beautiful young, kind of mesmerizing performance artist, who has a transgender ferret, and he falls in love with this young woman. He meets a homeless Slovenian poet philosopher, who holds literary salons in the men's washroom. He meets a librarian who's, a superhero, because all librarians are superheroes. And but then, perhaps the most significant interaction is he meets a book, right? And it's it's a very special talking object. It's his book, and the book and Benny start a conversation, and the book really teaches Benny to listen to the voices that really matter. So the whole novel is set up as and I was thinking of the way Fran was talking about framing tales, because in a way this is there's a framing device in this structure as well. The understanding is that the entire novel is a dialogue, is a conversation between Benny and the book. And so there's a kind of question there as to who is creating whom, right? Is the book sort of telling the story of Benny and sort of narrating Benny into existence, or is Benny actually the one who is creating the book, right? So it's which comes first, the chicken or the egg, who's writing whom. And so it's sort of the dialogue between the two of them. And since it's I guess since it's a book about voices, maybe what I'll do is just read a little bit, if that's okay, just from the beginning, so that you get a chance to hear what these voices sound like. Hang on just a second. Would that be okay, William? Do you think? Sounds good?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, good. So I will do that. I will read a little bit from the beginning of the book of Form and Emptiness. In the beginning. A book must start somewhere. One brave letter must volunteer to go first, laying itself on the line in an act of faith, from which a word takes heart and follows, drawing a sentence into its wake. From there, a paragraph amasses, and soon a page, and the book is on its way, finding a voice, calling itself into being. A book must start somewhere, and this one starts here. A boy. Shh, listen. That's my book, and it's talking to you. Can you hear it? It's okay if you can't, though. It's not your fault. Things speak all the time, but if your ears aren't attuned, you have to learn to listen. You can start by using your eyes, because eyes are easy. Look at all the things around you. What do you see? A book, obviously, and obviously the book is speaking to you, so try something more challenging. The chair you're sitting on, the pencil in your pocket, the sneaker on your foot. Still can't hear? Then get down on your knees and put your head to the seat, or take off your shoe and hold it to your ear. No, wait. If there are people around, they'll think you're mad, so try it with the pencil first. Pencils have stories inside them, and they're safe as long as you don't stick the point in your ear. Just hold it next to your head and listen. Can you hear the wood whisper, the ghost of the pine, the mutter of lead? Sometimes it's more than one voice. Sometimes it's a whole chorus of voices rising from a single thing, especially if it's a made thing with lots of different makers, but don't be scared. I think it depends on the kind of day they were having back in Guangdong or Laos or wherever. And if it was a good day at the old sweatshop, if they were enjoying a pleasant thought at the moment when that particular grommet came tumbling down the line and passed through their fingers, then that pleasant thought will cling to the whole. Sometimes it's not so much a thought as a feeling, a nice warm feeling, like love, for example, sunny and yellow. But when it's a sad feeling or an angry one that gets laced into your shoe, then you better watch out, because that shoe might do crazy shit, like marching your feet right up to the front of the Nike store, for example, where you could wind up smashing the display window with a baseball bat made of furious wood. If that happens, it's still not your fault. Just apologize to the window. Say, I'm sorry to the glass, and whatever you do, don't try to explain. The arresting officer doesn't care about the crappy conditions in the bat factory. He won't care about the chainsaws or the sturdy ash tree that the bat used to be. So just keep your mouth shut. Stay calm. Be polite. Remember to breathe. It's really important not to get upset, because then the voices will get the upper hand and take over your mind. Things are needy. They take up space. They want attention, and they'll drive you mad if you let them. So just remember, you're like the air traffic controller. No, wait, you're like the leader of a big brass band made up of all the jazzy stuff of the planet. And you're floating out there in space, standing on this great garbage heap of a world with your hair slicked back and your natty suit and your stick up in the air, surrounded by all the eager things. And for one quick, beautiful moment, all their voices go silent, waiting till you bring your baton down. Music or madness, it's totally up to you. The book. So start with the voices then. When did he first hear them? When he was still little? Benny was always a small boy and slow to develop, as though his cells were reluctant to multiply and take up space in the world. It seems he pretty much stopped growing when he turned 12, the same year his father died and his mother started putting on weight. The change was subtle, but Benny seemed to shrink as Annabelle grew, as if she were metabolizing her small son's grief along with her own. Yes, that seems right. Okay, I'll stop there. So that was just to kind of give you a sense of the dialogue that's emerging between Benny and the book, and the way that the conversation is starting to go backwards and forwards. And my idea was to suggest at the beginning there that the book is, kind of tentatively looking for the story. The book isn't quite sure yet of the ground it's standing on, but it's kind of listening and sort of groping towards the story that it's going to tell.
So I'd like to go back to something you said, Ruth, before you started your reading. You talked about the dialogue between Benny and his book, and the question of who's creating whom.
Yeah.
So that parody, and having just been talking about the dream tale, especially in the East Asian Buddhist context, of course, the thing that immediately came to mind is Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. Now, I don't
familiar with it. Tell us.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, this is what's incredible. For me to immediately see precedents, you might say, which clearly you didn't have in mind.
No, apparently.
Which is what's really fascinating. But let me start with Zhuangzi's butterfly tale. Zhuangzi is roughly 2nd century before the Common Era Taoist, Chinese Taoist philosopher whose records of writings had a tremendous impact on Chinese Buddhism, particularly the Chan tradition. But you see Chinese Buddhist figures referring to Zhuangzi all the time. And as a part of the Taoist tradition, the Taoists had a lot to say about dreams. Yeah. And Zhuangzi's butterfly tail, butterfly dream is perhaps the most famous of Taoist dream episodes. So it's a very short passage in which Zhuangzi says that, well, he narrates himself like in the 3rd person. He said, Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly, free and fluttering and so forth. But is it the case that Zhuangzi dreamt that he was the butterfly, or was it the butterfly who dreams that he is Zhuangzi? Okay, so he's now if you think again of the dream as an analog for fiction, or the imagination. I mean, he's asking essentially the same question. Yeah. Who's dreaming who?
Yeah.
Who's inventing who? Which is fundamentally a philosophical question about the nature of reality, about the nature of experience. And it's so easy to see why that story in Zhuangzi's philosophy generally was enfolded into Indian Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, with its teaching of impermanence and insubstantiality, which results into in the East Asian Buddhist adage that life is an illusion.
Yes,
just like a dream is. Yeah. But illusion is not necessarily a problem. It's a problem if you don't realize that perhaps some of your most deeply held commitments and ideas, especially about yourself, is ultimately a story.
Story, right, exactly. Right. Yeah.
Because if you don't realize that it's just a story, that is an illusion, then you suffer for it because you're beholden to it. In the belief that it's real or that it's necessary. But awakening to illusion gives you the ability to turn the imagination into a tool, into a skillful practice, right? But that entails this basic insight of the equality between what we considered reality, hard, uncompromisable, and on the other side, what we might call delusion or ignorance.
Yeah. Fascinating. And also, I'm thinking about the kind of reciprocal, the reciprocal kind of interbeing relationship between in my case the book and Benny, right, and the dependent co-arising, which is literally what the book is. What we're seeing is the book kind of dependently co-arise from that relationship, and then the same thing is true with the dream, right? The dream is dependently co-arising from how do you pronounce the name?
Zhuangzi,
and the butterfly, right?
And the idea of the transposability of subject and object. Who's the subject? Who's the object?
Who's the object? Exactly. Yeah.
It's another way of saying who's dreaming who.
Who's dreaming whom? Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Right. That's great. That's great. This actually, can I pick up right now on this idea of because one of the things that was interesting was that Zhuangzi is narrating himself in the 3rd person. And I wanted to ask, is that a convention? I mean, it's something that I did in A Tale for the Time Being. I narrated Ruth in the third person.
Right.
Not because just because it was, well, it made more sense to do that somehow. It put Ruth just slightly at a remove, which is what I needed. Yeah.
Right. Oh, very, very interesting question. I can't say this on the basis of real considered thought about all early Chinese philosophical writings, but Zhuangzi is very notable for his storytelling, which I don't think you get as much of when you look at these other classic texts, like such as that of Confucius, where stories are told about what he said and did by his students, or other I guess I'm thinking of, say, the Xunzi, which is another very important text. And he speaks mostly, discursively, like we're used to of expository or philosophical text, where thoughts are being laid out. There's no reference to characters or voices, but Zhuangzi is so notable in how he makes Confucius himself a character in his own philosophizing, and actually makes Confucius say things that, Confucius probably would not have said. He turns Confucius into a Taoist, essentially. And Zhuangzi tells many stories about animals, craftsmen. So he very much is a storyteller. I think that's something that's very important to note about him, his own literary style, and that is his way of doing philosophy.
Sure. It's fascinating. That's really fascinating. I'm always interested in voice, who is, and so one of the things that I was thinking in your earlier introduction was, the idea that, the book is the character, is the narrator, is talking directly to the reader, which is, what I'm doing in here too. Although sometimes the book is talking to Benny and sometimes the book is talking to the reader, and there's no indication which that is. It's just done in the language and the formality of the book's form of address. So that was really fun to write. The book has one tone of voice when it's talking to Benny, and it has another tone of voice when it's addressing the readers. So, just this is a kind of literary aside, but, when I was writing, I have always thought that real novelists, in the Western tradition, really needed to have mastered, and I use that word intentionally, the third person omniscient voice. Right. I mean, all of the great, the great works of literature, the great novels, have been written in that authoritative, omniscient, godlike tone. Right. And I thought, and I've tried to do this in several of my books, and I've failed each time. In All Over Creation, which is a book about power, right? It's about human control over nature. I thought that was a great book to really master this third person omniscient. And I tried, but one of the characters had a different idea about how this should go, and basically, sort of worked her way in and took over that narrative voice. And I had to kind of give it to her and give up, because when characters start behaving like that, you just have to go along with them. They know. In this book too, I started with this idea that I was going to write this in the third person omniscient, right? And I started out, doing that, and things were going very well, until suddenly Benny spoke up, and in the first person, using the first person I, interrupted the narration, right? And started objecting to the way the narrator was narrating his life, right?
Mhm.
And started complaining, basically. And so then the narrator, and of course, in the Western tradition, the narrator is always a kind of veiled author, right? It's
Right.
always a veiled me, right? And so once again, in this case, that's what I was working on, was a kind of a super omniscient, godlike stance. Benny interrupted and said, was just like, had all sorts of complaints about the way this was going. And then what happened was so strange, was that the omniscient voice that was kind of a disguised version of me suddenly separated from me and became the voice of the book and started talking directly to Benny and excluding me completely, right? I was sort of shut out of the process there. And that's when the idea of like, oh, of course, it's the book, a speaking object. I'm talking, the book is about speaking objects. And, the book has kind of peeled off and become its own character, right? And has actually taken over the role of the narrator of itself, right? And it's a conversation that's going on between Benny and the book. And sorry, Ruth.
Right.
It's just, there's no place for you here, which is why I'm kind of relegated to the role of the typing lady in the library.
Ah,
Yeah.
that was you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the norm of the omniscient voice, which we're so used to and which we expect generally in Western fiction writing, is itself tied, I suppose, to a view of reality. So
the theological view,
right,
a view of religion, a view of, exactly.
That it's possible to have omniscience, that it's possible to articulate, sort of the definitive story of, whatever characters and events the novel's focused on. If you start with a different metaphysical premise, then I think that also leads to different literary practices. So in my book on Buddhism and film, Seeing Like the Buddha, I looked at various movies which also tell stories, obviously, and many of them are adapted from novels, to see how a more Buddhist-oriented form of storytelling might unfold. So one of the movies I focused on is Akira Kurosawa's masterpiece film, Rashomon, which was made in 1950.
Love that film so much. Yeah.
Yeah. And without saying that he was a Buddhist or had Buddhist intentionalities, it's fascinating how he constructed the narrative of that film, which is not chronological strictly, going from beginning to end. And that's another convention, I think, in Western storytelling. It's chronological. It has a beginning. And Aristotle talked about it in his Poetics, the unity of plot, he called it. What Rashomon does is to narrate the same scene 4 different times from the perspective of the 4 different people who are present and even participants in the events in the forest, the rape that takes place in the forest. And it was very unconventional. He had a difficult time getting the green light from his studio to make it. They were very concerned.
When was it filmed? Yeah. When was it made again?
1950.
Oh, so
that's when it was released. Yeah, 1950. Oh,
so but the US censors were still there then as well, I would imagine.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, anyway, sorry.
It was recognized in the US as a remarkable movie. It was given an honorary Oscar like 2 years later, like in 1952, by Hollywood. But what's so unusual, and this is certainly a way of narrating an event, which is to tell it from the perspective of completely irreconcilable versions of the same event.
Right.
So it's a form of telling a story that refuses the omniscient voice. And this too is a frame tale, incidentally. And the woodcutter and the priest, who are the characters in the frame tale, are struggling over the fact that there can be such different versions of the exact same event that the people were a part of. And that's the major moral dilemma of the film. But the film refuses to resolve that tension. And I think, again, in telling the story in that way, it's making a significant philosophical point. So that's one way in which you can eject the omniscient voice. And tell a story.
In all of my books, I've always just naturally had more than one point of view character. You know, and you know, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's five. You know, I tend to like the the two, but and you know, I've always wondered, you know, without, you know, given the fact that, you know, that this idea of, I've just never believed in the omniscient point of view. You know, culturally, I don't believe in the omniscient point of view. You know, my mixed race, you know, sort of my DNA doesn't believe in the omniscient point of view. There is no unified, you know, point of view through which to, you know, by which to tell a tale, right? And so, you know, I don't know why I keep trying to force some kind of unification and integration, because clearly I'm incapable of it. But it's, you know, I think it's interesting, and now you've given me an idea actually for ways to, you know, to push that even further. And I love this. You know, the idea of four irreconcilable, you know, truths is really beautiful. So I'm going to work on that. It's excellent.
I look forward to reading it.
Okay, good.
It's done.
I'll dedicate it to you.
If I could follow up with a question regarding another comment you made, the reference to all the objects that speak in the book of Emptiness and Form.
Yeah.
I thought that was a fascinating idea, and also immediately in my academic way makes me index it to Buddhist concepts. I mean, the pencil that speaks, or the bat, and so forth. They all have voices. They can speak because they have stories, which to me is a direct evocation of the idea of dependent arising, as well as the Tendai Buddhist idea that even insentient objects have Buddha nature, because everything is implicated in this web of mutuality and dependency. So even things that don't have consciousness still have stories, because they embody within themselves their origins, or their, you know, synchronous conditions for existence, their functions, or the way they're used and perceived, you know, by the subjects that come into contact with them. So that led me to what I thought was an interesting tension in your latest novel regarding objects. Annabelle's hoarding, which is her fixation on objects and wanting, you know, like the teapots and the snow globes, right? which seemed to be a sign of a kind of dysfunctionality. It's a part of her inability to get it together, especially for the sake of her son, the hoarding in the house and so forth. So almost like intimations of over-consumerism, too much stuff in our homes, versus this idea of the living nature of these things that we hoard. I thought it was like, I didn't know where to come out at the end of that kind of give and take. On the one hand, it's junk and we're drowning in it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they have stories, and I really appreciated your description of Annabelle's love of the snow globe, or the performance artist, and the was she making snow globes as
She
well?
was making she was making catastrophic snow globes of natural disasters, and the earthquake and tsunami, or 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. Yeah, she was making these kind of catastrophic snow globes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you know, I've always had a strong feeling that objects have stories inside them. And I think that's partly being raised by a Japanese mother, and you know, the objects in my house that I grew up with were, you know, so many of them came from Japan, and so they were kind of exotic, and they were strange, and nobody else in New Haven had objects like that. And so, you know, there was a sense of them being special somehow. And that was on my mother's side. On my father's side, he was an anthropologist, and so he worked with the Oneida. He was an honorary member of the Oneida tribe, working with Oneida linguistics. And so he had received all sorts of gifts that were also obviously very special objects. And, you know, when they died, and you know, all of these objects, I'm an only child, when I had to, you know, deal with this house filled with objects, right? It was terrible, because I had this feeling that I knew that all of the objects had stories inside them, you know, but I was never going to know what the stories were, and, you know, they couldn't speak to me. And I kept wishing, oh, if only these objects could speak, right? But then, of course, what you're pointing out is that, you know, there's, you know, some objects, like, you know, like a, you know, some beautiful kimono or something like that is, you know, an object almost worthy of a story, right? Whereas some, you know, like, I don't know, like a toothpick, right? Is this object really worth a story? What kind of story would it have? Well, it would actually have a wonderful story, right?
Absolutely.
It would actually have a wonderful story, but I'll probably just toss it, you know? And so, but when you start thinking like that, the world becomes a very complicated, very cacophonous place, because, you know, there are just stories everywhere, right? And so anyway, that was something I was certainly thinking about as I was writing, you know, the book. How do we, you know, and I think we are drowning in stories, you know, not just the stories of objects, but stories in general. We're just, you know, with the internet, with everything else, we are, you know, literally drowning in stories. And, you know, and how, as a storyteller, do I make sense of that is a question that comes up for me all of the time. So, yeah. William, I saw that you were about to say something, and then we went, you know, zooming off on another tangent.
Well, it is so fun to hear the two of you doing your thing. One of the questions, thinking about what you were just talking about, and also going back to Fran's observation and indexing the way in which these stories are told through the objects, so the objects are telling stories, indexing it to a Buddhist idea. Another idea that arises is it takes a certain level of awakening to hear these stories, and to see, to hear the traditional way of saying it might be to hear the Dharma being articulated in the stories, or the sounds of the wind, or the stream. One of the questions that had been posed from one of the participants was about insanity, you had mentioned that Benny is being treated as someone suffering from some form of insanity, when another way of thinking about it, as we were just discussing, is a kind of awakening. And the question was about kind of, and it also goes, it's in relationship to multiple perspectives. Like what is one person's insanity might be another person's awakening.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
I'm wondering if you want to say anything about
Sure.
that. The questioner also was curious, Fran, about the role of insanity. Is there a role in the kind of East Asian dream, cloud, ephemeral texts that you're interested in, or is that something more of a Western construct in these novels? So Ruth, do you want to?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I have to preface this with a little personal story, but after my father died, for about a year after he died, I had an experience very much like Benny's, and it's the experience I gave to Benny, which was that from time to time, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 times, I would be doing something, random, like, I don't know, washing the dishes or folding laundry or something. And I would hear my father, he sounded like he was standing behind me and always on the right-hand side for some reason. And I would hear him clear his throat and say my name. Right. And I'd look around, and of course he wouldn't be there. And, and then, I'd feel that kind of hit of like, sadness and loss, that feeling of just being emptied out again. And it happened so quickly, right? It happened so quickly that every time it happened, I just kind of discounted it and went back to what I was doing, and would occasionally think about it, but not really, And then I was at an event talking about A Tale for the Time Being, and I was talking about how novels come to me as voices, how characters come to me as voices. And a man in the audience raised his hand and asked if, when I said that, did I mean I heard the voices as if with my ear, as if the voices were on the outside of me? Or was it more like I was hearing them, a kind of an internal experience, like I was hearing them with my mind, right? And he explained that the reason he was asking this question was because his son heard voices as if with his ear, as if they were on the outside of him, right? And the voices said, were very, very disturbing and said very cruel, very harsh things to him. And so this was a problem, right? And so the father and I talked, and I explained that that no, when I'm writing fiction, it's a more internal experience. I hear the voices with my mind. Right. But that I had this experience. I knew what he was talking about because I had also had this experience of hearing, having this unshared experience, right, of hearing somebody on the outside, my father, speaking to me. And I also, because I'm a writer, right, have very, frequently hear voices saying very harsh, very cruel things to me particularly about my writing. Right, that this is shit, and nobody's going to want to read this, and you should go get a job, and there are lots, it goes on and on. And so I started to think about this as a kind of spectrum, that on one hand, there are these voices that we call inspiration, right? And artists have them, and writers have them, and musicians have them. And thank goodness, we live in a culture where I can have an unshared experience, which is a novel, right? Inside me, I'm making it up, right? And I can write it down and put it out into the world, right? And nobody's going to lock me up or arrest me for that. I can imagine a society that might, arrest me for making stuff up, but this one, thank goodness, doesn't, right? And so then in the kind of middle range, we have the neurotic voices that we all, everybody grapples with, the inner critic, the inner judge, those kinds of neurotic voices. And then there are the voices on the, on this side, and those voices, again, are unshared experiences, the voice of that's happening as if it's on the outside of you, as if you're hearing it with your ear. And if they are, if you tell a psychiatrist about them, chances are you're going to be diagnosed as, having some sort of psychosis, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, something along those lines. And very likely you'll be medicated for it, particularly if the voices are bothering you, are disruptive, are causing you distress, and so that in that case, of course, they do need to be treated. The pathology, there's a reason for it to be pathologized. However, there are so many people who have that same experience of hearing voices, to whom it's not problematic at all. And, ironically, some of the, Mahatma Gandhi heard voices, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the fathers of modern psychology, heard voices. They write about hearing voices, right? Joan of Arc heard voices. I mean, I could go on and on. So, what I was getting at here was that what we call normal, right, is a cultural construct, right? We made up this idea of normal, right? And in the West, our version of normal is very narrow, right? But since it's a cultural construct, we can control it, right? We can do our best to kind of widen it out, to be more inclusive, to be more generous, right? And so I guess what I'm thinking is just, why, and I think, culturally, some of us anyway, are making an effort to do that, right? To sort of widen and broaden this idea of what is, what can be considered normal, right? And so anyway, that was the territory that I was working with. And, I have friends who are members of the Hearing Voices community, and, there's a wonderful sort of movement, grassroots movement happening. Intervoice is the website, and so this is happening, and it's a powerful grassroots movement, and it's just it's very interesting. I mean, certainly, in many cultures, a person who hears voices is, can be a religious figure, a shaman, somebody with great powers. So that's what I was thinking about when I was writing this. And yes, Fran, I'm curious about in,
well, as someone who works in the study of religion, of course, the idea of hearing voices is very common and attested across the board. And as you were saying, I mean, the line between the prophet, the inspired prophet, and the madman, it can be a very thin one. And you see historical examples, Jonestown is one that immediately comes to mind, where, you have people who have inspirations, whether it comes from a voice outside their head or an inner one. And what is defined as insanity versus genius, I suppose, is to a large degree culturally dependent, but I think it also depends on the results. I think what in Buddhist parlance would be called skillfulness. What do the voices lead you to do? It's what is skillful is not predicated on some conception, of some omniscient validity or truth, but in the effects, the karmic effects. Sometimes that kind of unconventionality can be written into the culture as, going back to literature, the figure of the Buddhist monk and the Taoist sage, they're often countercultural figures. They don't fit into the Confucian conception of appropriateness, propriety, dignity, and so forth. And yet it is the scabby-headed, rude, and socially unacceptable hidden sages, who speak a higher truth. So I think it's this question of the dynamic and the fine line of passage between skillful and unskillful forms of madness. But madness, I think, in one way or another, is valorized in many cultures.
Yeah, I've always appreciated that character, the wild, crazy, Zen monk or
Right.
Buddhist monk. I mean, those have always been my heroes. I felt
Mhm.
that there was room for me in this practice. If those guys, if those guys were allowed to do that, then great.
Mhm.
There was enormous amount of permission that's granted. So I love that.
So there's a couple of questions that get at the crux, perhaps, of what we're talking about tonight. One of them isn't Buddhism about moments, not stories? And I think when I read that question, one of the things that comes to mind is an idea that, well, Buddhist practice is about being in the moment, about sitting, about not reflecting on what's happened in the past or anticipating the future. And a story is, as Fran was quoting Aristotle earlier in the Poetics, as a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is not about being in the present moment. And I'm wondering if either of you have a response to that question. And there's a related question, which maybe you could also respond to, and that is, do you feel that novels can provide a meaningful or valid introduction to the Dharma as a practice, as opposed to being a distraction? I think there's a way in which one might think, well, this story that entrances us, that pulls us in, where we're having that dream that Fran was talking about at the beginning, where we're feeling like we're living this life. Some sense I can imagine the person suggesting that Buddhism is about moments is saying, well, that's not your life. That's not reality. And reality is attending to your sensations now and letting your thoughts go and letting the stories go. Wondering if either of you would have a response to that.
Yeah, I
take
think
that. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I think I
Start,
can
yeah.
talk to the question of being in the moment, being present versus narrative, which presumes a linearity and it unfolds through time. I think the two are connected, though, in Buddhist thought, because your ability, the way you experience the present is very much reflective of the dispositions that you have cultivated through time, through religious discipline, through the forms of ritual, let's say, or I would say taking in stories through novels, through movies. And I do believe reading novels and watching movies can be a form of Buddhist cultivation. The present moment is connected karmically to the question of what came before and how that present moment is orienting you to what comes next. So early Buddhist thought is, I think, more concerned with the continuity of personhood through the law of karma, which then allows a person to cultivate the proper dispositions that allow him or her to become a Buddha. I think in the Mahayana, and particularly the East Asian expression, there's a greater interest in the moment, in one snapshot moment in time, and the way it's connected synchronously across the web of existence and the universe. But I don't think ultimately they can be divorced from each other. So the way you express yourself or experience yourself in the moment is karmically determined by your practices through time. So I see them as being two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's also interesting that, I mean, I practice in a Zen tradition, and Zen is, traditionally, very disparaging of words and letters, right? I mean, the founder of the Zen lineage, Bodhidharma, the first Zen ancestor, right, is quoted. There's this verse that's attributed to him. It's Zen is a special transmission outside the scriptures. Okay, so outside the scriptures, not founded upon words and letters. By pointing directly to one's mind, it lets one see one's own true nature and thus attain Buddhahood, right? And so there's this kind of disparagement of, of this representation, the whole thing about the finger pointing at the moon, the finger is not the Dharma, right? And this is, I think this is so funny because, well, for a lot of reasons. One is that verse probably is a fiction, right? It probably it was probably not something that Bodhidharma ever said.
Right.
It seems like it was written thousands of years, or hundreds of
like
years
in the
later.
Song Dynasty, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's fiction number one, right? But the other thing too is that that Zen, the Zen teachings are all told in terms of small stories. I mean, koans are nothing but story, right? And so for for a religious practice that disparages storytelling, there's probably no other religious practice that has so many codified stories in its liturgies, right? So, which is not to defend anything, but it's also to point at where this idea of the suspicion of stories come from, and this idea that that enlightenment is something that happens in an instant, right? It's just like instantaneous versus a kind of sort of gradual practice based outcome. So this is this really, I think, points to a long sort of division in Buddhist history. I know mostly from the Japanese point of view, but this is a long-standing division and argument.
Well, I have another story from Zhuangzi that I think kind of captures the Zen spirit that Ruth was just talking about. And I think he's speaking in the first person here. He says, the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you have the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you have the rabbit, you can forget the snare. And a couple of more parallel examples. Then he says, words exist because of meaning. Once you get the meaning, you can forget the words. Where is the person who has forgotten words so that I might have a word with him?
I love that.
Once you've forgotten the words, then you're capable of speaking.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. I have a feeling Dogen must have been very familiar with that.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Oops. William, you're muted, I think.
Yes,
there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there are a bunch of really great questions, and I apologize to those of you who submitted them that we won't get through all of them. But here's one that I would invite the two of you to reflect on. And it's about the differences or similarities between the images that might arise in fiction and the images that might arise in a sacred text or sutras. And I think I'm interpreting the question to be, well, what's the difference between reading a work of fiction and reading a work that we take to be sacred as far as gaining insight into the Dharma? Or Fran, you argue in your book that watching a movie can be kind of like a ritualized engagement with a sacred, essentially with an icon, that it can do something to us. And I'm wondering if either of you or both of you might want to address this question.
Well, I would just, say that in Japan, I wish I could remember the name of this category of person. Basically, they were entertainers. They were priests. I think they were ordained, but they were entertainers. And their job was to go around from town to town, village to village, and, put on these plays and tell these stories that were quite, I think they were quite, sort of, they were exciting, they were out there, they were very entertaining, they were ribald, but they were looked at as being, they were speaking the Dharma, right? And so I look at this as kind of skillful means, and that for every person there's a different approach that is going to be effective, and some people prefer this, and for some people this will be effective. There's no one size answer to all of them. I see myself as being kind of one of those sort of traveling itinerant performers, who is going to tell ribald tales, and maybe somebody will, I mean, I'm also not writing in order to teach the Dharma. I'm writing in order to practice the Dharma. So that's different, right? It's not like I have a pedagogical, motive when I start out, or objective when I start out. It's not that at all. It's that writing is a way of thinking. It's a practice for me. It's the way that I understand the world. And so when I'm writing, I'm thinking, I am really trying to work out, a koan of my own, in sentient beings speak the Dharma. What does that mean? What is what is real? What is real? What is, what is illusion, and what's the, relationship between those? These are the kinds of koans that I'm working on as I write. So.
I think it's useful to note that you can have different interpretations of what a text does. In ordinary understandings of scriptures, I suppose particularly in the Christian context, there's the idea that scriptures speak truth, they're revelations, they're divine knowledge. The gospel is something that is news that's revealed to humankind, and it's information that was not known before. So there's this notion of truthfulness of scriptures as being divine words. And it's not just Christianity. You might think of Vedic traditions operating in the same mode. But there's another way in which literature can function religiously, and it might be more in the ethical as opposed to revealed knowledge vein, in that partaking of a creative work engages our emotions. That's why we read novels and watch movies, to be completely, utterly entranced in that world, in that reality. And to me, that is like what religious rituals do. If you participate in the ritual of communion, you act and you believe as if the wafer and the wine is the blood and body of Christ. And I don't think it matters one whit whether it's true or not, or whether you believe that it's scientifically or objectively true. What's important is what you feel, what you call into your reality through that ritual experience. And I think creative works, literature, we can make choices about what worlds to occupy. And that's a very important ethical and religious choice, because by doing so, occupying certain kinds of worlds, we are cultivating our own dispositions. We are honing our own abilities to see and think in certain ways. And so in that sense, you can move towards better or worse ways of constructing the world, or your experience of the world. And I think this, without getting into too much academic details, this is a very different, culturally different understanding of poetics, the function of art. It's not trying to imitate, or it's not just a shadowy version of reality. It is a way of training, the way we experience the world.
And this really reminds me of Dogen's Dogen's understanding of zazen, and ritual. That it's I mean, Taigen Dan Layton in some of his writing calls zazen a performance art. Right?
Yes.
And I think that's actually really accurate, because when you sit down to, when you sit zazen, you're not sitting for any reason, right? It's not like you're trying to achieve something or attain something. There's no objective there. When you're sitting down, to sit zazen, you are just expressing your Buddha nature, right? In other words, you are becoming Buddha, right? When you sit zazen, you are Buddha. Right. And the whole thing with ritual too, when you do ritual, you are, with everyone else, you are the Buddha body. Right. So these are all, and I also look at things like flower arrangement or tea ceremony, or, Knoll performance, which I did for years. All of these are expressions of your practice. Right? So they're ritualistic in that way. I don't think there is that much, sorry, my cats. I don't think there is much difference, between art and practice, Buddhist practice. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Maybe one last question. We have a few minutes for it. Ruth, the question was about the title of your book, The Book of Form and Emptiness.
Yeah.
And if you could say a few words about what form and emptiness might mean more generally, that you're drawing on it, that your history of it, but then how it's being used as the title of your book.
Sure. Well, the phrase form and emptiness comes from the Heart Sutra, which is one of the key Mahayana Buddhist texts, chants and we chant it every day. And the phrase is, excuse me, shikifu iku kufu ishi. Well, I'll say form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Form itself is emptiness. Emptiness is itself form. And, so this is, that doesn't really help that much, but the word emptiness is one of those, is a word that is, it's hard to translate, and to get it right in English. I mean, people have used the word emptiness, and that works for me. I've also heard it expressed as boundlessness, right? That's another way of thinking of it. The problem with emptiness is it sounds so empty, right? It sounds so bleak. But in any case, the idea is just, a kind of metaphor that I, think is useful when thinking about this is if you imagine, emptiness as being a vast, endless ocean, right? It's just this vast, endless ocean. And that's the field of emptiness, right? And the planet moves, and the tides affect the ocean, and there's gravitational pull, and the winds sort of blow, and from all of this a little wave starts to pop up, right? And the wave kind of gets higher and higher and higher than, you know, the vast empty ocean around it, right? And suddenly the wave is like, whoa, you know, like, look at me, you know, I'm really something. Like, look at me, I'm taller than everybody else. I've got form, right? So this is the kind of, you know, this moment of form, and the wave feels, you know, very substantial and a whole lot like superior to, you know, the ocean around him. And then of course, you know, the planet turns and the, you know, wind blows and the tides, you know, do what they do. And suddenly the, you know, the wave starts to sink back down into the ocean. And it's like, oh shit, you know, wait a minute, what happened? You know, and suddenly the, you know, the wave disappears and is part of the vast emptiness of the ocean again, right? So it's that relationship between form and emptiness, right? Emptiness and form. And so that's kind of a nice way to think about it. And it's that's the kind of relationship that I was playing with in the book, you know, and it, you know, the idea of the book's emergence from the dialogue, you know, from the dialogue between Benny and you know, the book sort of emerges from that, right? But there's other elements in the book which kind of play with that idea as well, right? So, you know, emptiness is really, I mean, what it's the key teaching there is the teaching of no self, the teaching of impermanence, and the teaching of dependent co-arising. And so the phrase emptiness kind of includes all of those things, right? So, and that's, yeah, I mean, I knew it was a kind of sort of abstract title, but I liked it.
Well, thank you so much. As one of the comments just came in, this terrific talk. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Ruth. I want to end by saying a couple things. One is that at BCBS, we don't contract with our teachers or speakers. We follow a longstanding Buddhist tradition of Dharma, and we thank those of you who are listening. For some of you already made some generous donations that will go to the speakers tonight and also to BCBS a little bit for putting this on. And one of the, you know, when I think about the imagination and fiction, I think of somebody who said not long ago, it's easier for us to imagine the earth being destroyed by an asteroid than to imagine the end to capitalism. Zizek, somebody who said that.
Of course, yeah.
And there's a way in which Dharma practice is a practice which imagines maybe not the end of capitalism, but an alternative to capitalism, that we invite a space where the Dharma is shared, where people can gather, and our teachers trust in the generosity of our participants, and BCBS does, just like our participants trust in the generosity of our teachers to share what we all share. And generosity is the first virtue of the Bodhisattva in Buddhist traditions. And it's really important because it's a practice of not living a life the way Fran was describing the guy in the dream who is just trying to get as much as he can. It's generosity is the practice of relinquishing that which we don't need to cling to and meeting the direct needs of others. I find it really inspiring being at an institution that functions on the basis of Dharma. All of that to say, with COVID, we understand that many people are having hardships, and if you are so moved, we welcome a offering to the teachers and to the center. It's what allows us to keep doing what we do. And I believe Cassie was going to, yes, there is a link in the chat if you would like to follow that link and make an offering. So thank you so much, everyone. I should also say that Ruth will be offering a residential program at BCBS in April. And there are other programs that we offer that explore Dharma and poetry and fiction and song. And I hope to see some of you in Barrie before too long, and Ruth and Fran, you too as well.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Ruth,
you.
for hosting us, and Fran, thank you for all of your wonderful,
Wonderful
wonderful, yeah,
conversation.
really fun. Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming.